Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Today is the opening day of the National People's Congress. As we discussed in yesterday's video, we should get a draft government work report and this year's draft plan for national economic development today. In an interesting development, at a press conference yesterday, the official spokesperson for the National People's Congress announced that Premier Li Qiang will not give a press conference at the end of the event. This is a practice which had happened every year, going back 3 decades. Quote, "There are a lot of guesses as to why this practice is ending. Mine is that this is just another step in the relative diminution of the Premier and his role under Xi. Premier Li has already taken a lower public profile than his predecessors. He did not go visit victims during the huge flooding last year. He did not inspect the efforts to help stranded travellers during the recent terrible weather during the Spring Festival migration. And this may just fit with avoiding any possibility of people thinking there is any sort of alternative power centre, no matter how far from reality those wishes may be. Like I said, this is my guess. I doubt we will ever get a definitive answer, but the announcement has just added to concerns about the growing opacity of the government." End quote. Meanwhile, as we noted, the National People's Congress kicked off today, but it does so 24 people short, a sign of the political times in Beijing. The 24 people who have left what some commentators call a rubber stamp parliament include ousted Foreign Minister Qin Gang, 10 former senior military officials, half of whom were involved in the country's rocket force, as well as a number of disgraced local government officials and several company executives. As I write this episode, the news has broken that China will set its target for 2024 GDP growth at around 5%. This is the same as last year's goal and is in line with forecasts. We will have more to discuss on the growth target and policy once we have more information in tomorrow's video. Of course, whether this around 5% growth is healthy or not is the key question. Indeed, state media appears to be preparing the population for accelerating economic slowdown. In top party ideology publication Geostrategic this week, the outlet quoted General Secretary Xi Jinping as expressing, quote, "It is not the case that a higher economic growth rate means the situation is very good, nor does a decrease in economic growth mean the situation is very bad. We must adhere to the correct view of achievements, not simply judge heroes by GDP growth rates, and not be swayed by short-term economic indicators. Judging whether the economy is good or not should not only consider the total amount of speed, but also the quality of China's economic development." End quote. The Geostrategic piece concludes in a somewhat defensive manner too. Quote, "In the face of the historic achievements of China's economic development, the so-called China economic peak theory, China's economic collapse theory, and other arguments that talk down China's economy have no factual basis and are self-defeating." End quote. Goldman Sachs evidently did not get the memo. This week in an interview with US media, Goldman Sachs Wealth Management CIO expressed, quote, "All our clients are asking us the same question. Given how cheap China appears, people inevitably say, well, has it discounted the worst news?" End quote. Here referring to the stock market, citing expectations for a steady slowdown in the economy over the next decade and a weakening in its traditional 3 pillars of growth, the property market, infrastructure and exports. The senior bank executive concluded, quote, "It is our view that one should not invest in China." End quote. Last month, the benchmark CSI 300 index sank to a 5-year low. Next up, energy, climate, EVs, and the expanding trade war. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, please, it's a huge help if you can hit that like button. Subscribing is also a big help. About half of the regular audience is currently not subscribed, and this is also a help for the channel. And for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable, I rely primarily on your support in this regard. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, we talk high technology and energy. Last week, the Politburo of the party's Central Committee held the so-called 12th Group Study Session on new energy technology and China's energy security. The readout from the session was fairly boilerplate, but worth noting here. Quote, "To respond to global climate change, the international community has reached the consensus to actively develop clean energy and promote the green and low-carbon transition in economic and social development. We should follow this general trend, seize the opportunities and intensify efforts to promote high-quality development of new energy in China. In this way, we will secure safe and reliable energy supply for advancing Chinese modernization and make greater contributions to the building of a clean and beautiful world." End quote. Unfortunately, China is underperforming on one of its main climate goals, cutting the amount of energy needed for economic growth. This week, US outlet Bloomberg writes that in its 5-year plan that began in 2021, China set out to reduce the amount of energy consumed for each unit of gross domestic product by 13.5%. Quote, "When it announced the aim, the math was simple: energy used and GDP." End quote. But the rules were changed in late 2022, quote, "after global energy costs soared and China had suffered a series of embarrassing power outages. Neither renewables nor any energy source used as a feedstock, such as coal converted into chemicals, would be counted." End quote. We covered these developments at the time on China Update. The impact of all this has become quite clear this year, however, the first in which the new formula was used. Energy consumption jumped 5.7%, more than the 5.2% increase in GDP, so energy intensity should have risen. Instead, the new math showed China reported a 0.5% drop. Thus, at least based on the original formulation, in the last several years, not only has growth been unhealthy in that it has relied on surging debt, but it has also relied on higher levels of non-renewable energy input to achieve. Meanwhile, Beijing has responded to the news last week that the US will conduct a national security risk review of connected smart vehicles manufactured in China. We covered this development last week. Yesterday, Monday, a Ministry of Commerce spokesperson told reporters at a press conference event in Beijing, quote, "The US, under the pretext of national security, intends to hinder the normal export of Chinese automobiles, and China expresses serious concern over this. Under the guise of national security, it intends to set up non-tariff barriers, which is a typical protectionist practice. This will disrupt and distort the global automotive industry supply chain and also harm the interests of American consumers. China will continue to assess the follow-up situation of the US review and will take strong measures if necessary to resolutely safeguard its legitimate rights and interests." End quote. As we discussed last week with the US investigation news, we should expect Tesla, General Motors and Ford, out of concern for their massive China business, and likely under pressure from Beijing itself, to lobby Washington during its review of Chinese-made smart vehicles. Tesla may already be in some trouble. The US automaker shipped 60,365 vehicles from its China factory in February, the lowest since December 2022, and down almost 16% month-on-month. Year-on-year, it was a decrease of 19%. We note that some of this would have been due to the Lunar New Year holiday falling in February. And even Apple may be concerned too. In a recent interview, US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said, quote, "Cars these days are like iPhones on wheels. You connect your phone and you might receive the text message. Imagine a world with 3 million Chinese vehicles on the roads of America, and Beijing can turn them off at the same time." End quote. In response to this comment, Mao Ning, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, expressed on Monday, yesterday, quote, "Shouldn't China be worried about Washington's ability to get hundreds of millions of Apple phones of Chinese users to channel collected information back to the US, or even cause a blanket screen shutdown?" End quote. Hua Chunying, another foreign ministry spokesperson and senior foreign ministry official, on Sunday made a similar threat, posting, quote, "Kindly remind at Sec Raimondo that iPhones are American products. Were you suggesting that iPhones, Tesla, and even Boeing have been sending secret data back to the US that could be shut down at any time by Washington?" End quote. The technology and trade war between the US and China, and increasingly the EU and China too, continues to boil up. with EVs looking to be the next important front, and China is preparing for it. In an interview with Chinese financial media outlet Caixin last week, Miao Wei, former head of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, expressed, quote, "The markets of developed countries like Europe and the US have high profit margins, but also high barriers to entry, such as the industrial policy restrictions contained in the US Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the EU's anti-subsidy investigations. I believe the Chinese government will not sit and watch Chinese new energy vehicle companies suffer losses overseas, and there will be countermeasures. Trade wars often involve a power play between both sides, and often end up being lose-lose. China's vast and increasingly mature auto market still holds bargaining advantages, a fact that European automakers operating in China for years should recognize." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.